I am a little curious as to why you'd have any interest in me. I was a very plain man. I never got rich. I did do my duty for God, country, and the Masons. Other than my time in the Union Army and a few years in Minnesota and Michigan, I lived a very contented life in Glens Falls. I worked for the architect and builder Hiram Crum, and I owned a building supply store on South Street. I was born in South Londonderry, Vermont on July the 5th of 1840. My father, William Thompson, was not one to stay in any one place very long, so soon after that we moved to Smith Basin, and then a few years later on to Fort Ann, and finally he ran a general store in South Glens Falls. I had avoided fighting in the war the first couple of years, but when the Union draft was instituted by Mr. Lincoln and his generals in March of 1863, I knew I had no choice. I also knew that if I was drafted, I'd have little control of where I went or who I fought with. So I made the decision to enlist. I traveled to Saratoga on July 10th of 1863 and signed a 3-year enlistment with the Veterans Cavalry Company F. I signed on for the Quartermaster Corps. I would oversee the provisions and ammunition of the soldiers. I thought it would be safer than going in the infantry, less likely to get shot. But I was somewhat naive and seemed like a good idea at the time. I got my mustering in orders and I decided I wanted to be married. I wanted to learn the mysteries of women, what the fuss was all about. I didn't want to die on the battlefield an innocent. Now, I had met Sophia Stimpson of Ludlow, Vermont, when I was a boy. Her parents, Charles and Eliza, had Sophia later in life, so she had a certain maturity that I didn't have. So I traveled to Ludlow and I spoke to her father and I told him of my plans to go to war and that I wanted to marry his daughter. Well, Sophia was very keen on the idea, and her father knew that if something happened to me, that she'd get a small pension, so he consented. On July 30th of 1863, we were married, and then on August 26th, I was sent off. A man with a wonderful reason to come back alive. I served with the Empire Light Cavalry. We sustained 10 casualties during the war and over 30 seriously wounded. I served in Louisiana, Florida, and then finally in Alabama. I was mustered out a second lieutenant on November 8th of 1865 in Talladega. I had suffered a small stomach wound during the war, but the doctors didn't think it was anything too serious. I returned home filled with adventure. So I packed up what few belongings Sophia and I had, and we went west to Minnesota. I found no fortune there. So we came back to Glens Falls. I worked for my father for a short time in that general store, and then I was hired by Hiram Crum, the architect and builder. he put me through some very rigorous training, but I had a knack for planning and building. He had a friend, his name was Griffin. He had an interest in an iron mill out in Michigan. Well, I had a sister, Teresa, and her husband, Frank, that lived in Detroit, so I decided that I would volunteer to go out and oversee that mill. Well, we were there about 2 years and then returned home in 1884 at the same time that Mr. Crum was building the Crandall block on the corner of South and Glen Street. Well, we never left home again. I opened that contractor supply store on 23 South Street, and we lived above the store. Sophia and I had 3 children, Albert N., Charles, and a lovely little girl that we lost in her first month of life while we were out in Michigan. I also took care of my father when he got older. He was a very frail 85-year-old in 1900, so we had him come live with us. Fortunately, we had an Irish girl that did most of the work. Her name was Bina Hickey. Now, I oversaw most of the construction of Mr. Crum's buildings for 20 years. The Glen Street YMCA, the Ridge Street School, the Home for Aged Women on Warren Street, as well as the B.B. Fowler Building. We also built residential homes for some of the prominent citizens. William McEachran, Mrs. H.A. Bowden, Mrs. Thomas Burnham, as well as the Leggett, Finch, and the Moore homes. I was a trusted citizen of the community. I served on the board of directors of Christ Church Methodist as well as the Crandall Library, and I was president of the village trustees for 1 year and then served on the board for 2 years more. I was very active in the Masons. I was commander of the Grand Army of the Republic, GAR post. Although I didn't lead a particularly exciting life, I did earn the respect of the community. I died on February 12th of 1903. I was 63 years old. The physician said that it had been an ulcer in my stomach that was made worse by that wound I received during the war. My wife Sophia and my son Albert were left to mourn me. Charles had passed away a few years before in 1899. If I had lived longer, I would have continued to quietly go about the work to make this community a better place to live. Well, I have enjoyed talking with you. Thank you very much for coming by.